So the Supreme Court just requested a response in the emergency application, which is challenging the state of New York's recent defiance of the Supreme Court's New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen decision. So let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think it's time for the Supreme Court to once again affirm our right to keep and bear arms, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Also, I want to give a shout out to one of the main supporters of this channel, which is CCIA. Through your membership, you get training, education, and self-defense liability protection. So if you carry a firearm, I highly recommend you take a look into CCIA, and I'll put a link to them down in the details section. How's it going, everyone? My name is Anthony Miranda. I am a licensed and practicing attorney in the state of California with an emphasis on Second Amendment rights. I've been part of Second Amendment litigation both at the state level and a national level while serving as a staff attorney with the Firearms Policy Coalition legal team. My goal with these videos is not to provide you any legal advice, but instead to help you understand what's currently going on in the battle for our right to keep and bear arms. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, I have an update for you in the recent efforts to get the Supreme Court to grant emergency application and review a case which is challenging the state of New York's new concealed carry laws, which they passed in direct defiance to the Supreme Court's recent ruling in Bruen. Gun Owners of America has filed an emergency application for immediate administrative relief in their Antioch v. Negrelli case, which is a challenge to the state of New York's new Concealed Carry Improvement Act. Now, the Supreme Court has issued a request for the state of New York to file a response to that emergency application and answer to the Supreme Court why the Supreme Court should not vacate the Second Circuit stay and maybe why the Supreme Court should not review this issue. This case arises out of a lawsuit filed by GOA in the state of New York in a federal court in the state of New York because of the new concealed carry laws which the state of New York passed in direct defiance to the Supreme Court's ruling in Bruen. In Bruen, the Supreme Court struck down the state of New York's May issue CCW licensing scheme, finding that it was inconsistent with this nation's history and tradition. One of the primary findings of that Bruen decision was that the government bears the burden to prove that their restrictions are based in the history and tradition of our nation. But another important thing that the Supreme Court did in that decision is they said a state like New York cannot simply make the entire state a sensitive location. They cannot simply make everywhere within the state a gun-free zone. However, despite that decision, the state of New York rushed through the Concealed Carry Improvement Act only 8 days after that decision, and it created a scheme that's worse than the one that existed even prior to Bruen. GOA filed a lawsuit against the state of New York. In that case, a federal district court judge, Judge Sotheby, heard GOA's request for a preliminary injunction, and ultimately, he granted the request for a preliminary injunction against those various aspects of the CCIA. He struck down aspects of that law like the good moral character standard, and also struck down the catch-all sensitive location restrictions. After that, New York then decided to appeal the granting of the preliminary injunction up to the Second Circuit. Along with that request for an appeal, they also requested that the Second Circuit there place a stay on the judgment of Judge Sotheby. The Second Circuit ultimately granted the stay, which prevents Judge Sotheby's preliminary injunction from having any impact currently. However, instead of just waiting around for the Second Circuit to do the right thing to hear the case, GOA has filed an emergency application up to the Supreme Court. The emergency application asks the Supreme Court to vacate the Second Circuit's granting of that stay. Therefore, if the vacating of that stay was granted by the Supreme Court, Judge Sotheby's lower court preliminary injunction would be allowed to go into effect, and therefore it would protect the Second Amendment rights of those individuals in the state of New York because it would enjoin those various aspects of the CCIA, including the sensitive location catch-all provision, and also the good moral character standard and a lot of other provisions as well. This application was filed to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who is the justice responsible for reviewing emergency applications which are made in the Second Circuit. She does have the authority to grant, deny, or refer the application to the full court, but that doesn't mean that the story will really end just with that one justice. If she decided to take no action on the application and not to grant it, then GOA could go to any other justice and request that they grant that emergency application. So there are other ways to get around Sonia Sotomayor if she decides to not grant the application. Well, we recently received news today that a request for a response was issued by Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Currently, the response of the state of New York is due by 4 p.m. on January 3rd. So that's in just a week. The state of New York will need to file a brief arguing to the Supreme Court and kind of rationalizing to Sonia Sotomayor why the court does not need to be granting an emergency application on this issue and why they should not simply vacate the Second Circuit stay in this case. So all indications are that the Supreme Court is considering the emergency application. Sonia Sotomayor still has control of this. She's the one that requested the response. A request to file a response does not always necessarily happen in these situations. According to the Supreme Court's reporter guide, a justice may call for a response from the opposition before reaching a final decision. Such responses are usually due by a certain date and time. The justice may grant an interim stay pending receipt and consideration of a response. So a response is something that is not necessarily required in this type of situation, but can happen. And in this situation, it appears that Justice Sonia Sotomayor, or likely maybe some pressure from another justice, but it was Sonia Sotomayor who requested the response, and is wanting some sort of rationale by the state of New York about why she should not grant this emergency application. Now, what that response will look like by the state of New York will be very interesting to see. I don't see the state of New York arguing heavily in the response that their new CCIA law is constitutional or in line with the recent Supreme Court decision in Bruen. That's going to be a very hard sell, especially if this ever makes it up to the full court and the 6 justices who voted in favor of the Bruen decision, who were part of the majority opinion. I don't see them falling in line with that type of rationale that the state of New York would put forward. Instead, I see New York trying to argue that the emergency application is not needed at this specific time. They will likely push for the Supreme Court to let the Second Circuit hear the merits of this case before ultimately getting involved in this issue. The state of New York will also likely argue that the state residents are allegedly not suffering any harm whatsoever by the CCIA and that it's in the public's best interest to not lift the stay at this time. The state will likely try to align their argument the best they can, more towards the arguments made in the preliminary injunction down below. And also they will likely try to stay within the structure of when circuit court acts on these types of issues, when it's appropriate for circuit courts to grant a stay. They might try to align their argument saying it was appropriate for the Second Circuit to grant this stay and that it was within their discretion and they didn't do anything wrong. I think the state of New York will stay very far away from arguing the merits of this issue of whether the CCIA is constitutional or not. And also, they will likely not argue whether it aligns with the Bruen decision, because I think if they go down that route, it's not going to end very well for them, especially when this makes its way to a full court vote. But regardless of what they ultimately argue, I think the Supreme Court must vacate the lower court stay here and reiterate in some sort of opinion that this type of concealed carry law and scheme that the state of New York has passed, that New Jersey recently passed, and that California is planning to pass and is going to present once again, is indeed unconstitutional, violates the Second Amendment, and does not adhere to what they said in Bruen. So the state of New York has until January 3rd to file their response, and then Justice Sonia Sotomayor will decide whether or not she wants to grant that emergency application. So this is something I will definitely keep my eyes on. The shadow docket stuff moves a lot faster than the traditional Supreme Court stuff and those types of traditional actions. You can see that by how fast this is moving even at the holiday season. So it's something that will be developing likely fast. Again, January 3rd is just a week away. So if we get any more information, I will let you all know. Also, if you have any questions, go ahead and comment down below and I'll try to answer best my ability. Also, if you like this video and like support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or fuel Al Gore's rhythm. It adds fuel to his jet and signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. As always, I want to thank everybody who likes, comments, subscribes, who hits the notification bell, who shares these videos. You guys are directly impacting these videos, impacting this channel, helping me to reach and educate more people than I could ever do on my own. So as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and the station will be maintained by armed scholars.